Now, next section, the modern constitutional consensus, non-establishment with equal respect. Now, as I've said, the liberty of conscience tradition quickly became skeptical of any kind of religious establishment on the grounds that it is violence to the soul to impose any kind of orthodoxy on the striving individual conscience. Establishments were worst when they threatened liberty, penalizing people for non-orthodox worship, or forcing them to affirm orthodox sentiments that they might not believe, or attaching conditions of religious orthodoxy to a person's civil rights or ability to hold office. It was quickly understood, however, that even an apparently benign establishment fosters inequality by making a public statement that the government of the nation endorses a particular brand of religion. This endorsement is at the same time inevitably a disendorsement, creating an in-group and an out-group. As Madison wrote in 1785, quote, "All men are to be considered as entering into society on equal conditions." And he went on to say, even a non-coercive establishment violates that equality. Now, Madison was speaking in 1785 in opposition to a proposal that is really very benign. It was a proposal to tax all the citizens of Virginia for the support of the established Anglican Church. But according to this proposal, citizens who were not Anglicans would be permitted to divert their tax payments to their own churches. And if you were a Mennonite or a Quaker, you didn't have to pay at all. Nonetheless, Madison thought that the bare announcement that the Anglican Church was the state church created ranks and orders of citizens. In 1984, discussing the U.S. Constitution's ban on religious establishment, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor recapitulated the long Madisonian tradition. The Establishment Clause, she says, prohibits government from making adherence to a religion relevant in any way to a person's standing in the political community. Endorsement sends a message to non-adherents that they are outsiders, not full members of the political community, and an accompanying message to adherents that they are insiders, favored members of the political community. According to Justice O'Connor's very helpful analysis, which she developed through a whole series of cases in the 1980s, the right question to ask of any potentially problematic policy in the area of religious establishment is the following question: would an objective observer, acquainted with all the relevant historical and contextual facts, view the policy in question as one that makes a public statement of endorsement or disendorsement compromising equality? With this idea in mind, let's look briefly at three areas of past and present controversy: school prayer, public displays, and the state funding of religious schools. In each case, I'm just going to take one case as an example of the tradition. All American public schools used to include quite a lot of religious observance: prayer, Bible reading, and so on. Inevitably, these observances were Protestant in nature, and people didn't even notice how unfair they were to others. Bible readings were from the King James Version. The Ten Commandments were cited in their Protestant version, which Catholics do not accept, and so on. When Catholics protested, they were not well treated. Catholic children were often beaten for refusing to say the Protestant version of the commandments. By the mid-20th century, those barbarisms had been rejected, and people sometimes even allowed a choice among versions of the Bible, but there was still an implicit rejection of anything non-Christian. In a small town in Pennsylvania in the 1950s, law required a Bible reading at the start of the school day. A student would be chosen to lead it every day, and then that student would go to the school's PA room and then read it, and it would be broadcast through the PA system all over the school. 16-year-old Ellery Schempp, a very bright and thoughtful young man who's now a distinguished research physicist, thought about this custom and thought it was probably unconstitutional. He decided that he was going to challenge it. On his day to lead the Bible reading, he brought in a copy of the Quran and read from that. Now, I should say this is well before there were more than a handful of Muslims in America, and nobody at all was thinking about Muslim sensitivities. In fact, if you read the case, you don't even find out that the book he brought in was the Quran. It was just, it was a notional thing, and Schempp himself was a Unitarian and still is. He was just making a point about the statement of exclusion that was made by the school policy. Immediately, the school principal summoned Schempp to his office and subjected him to disciplinary action. And this same principal then wrote to all the universities to which Schempp had applied, telling them not to admit this troublemaker. And in fact, I should tell you that he had applied to lots of places, the only one that accepted him in the face of this was Tufts University. And then the principal called up the admissions office of Tufts University and said, "You made a big mistake, you should not admit this young man." But Tufts stood firm, and he graduated from Tufts in 3 years and then went to graduate school at Brown, so ending up in Rhode Island, where our story starts. So anyway, Schempp, still in high school, borrowed his father's typewriter and typed a letter to the American Civil Liberties Union, enclosing $10 that he had saved up from his allowance and asking them to take his case. This is one of the rare cases that I've found where a child is more than an occasion for the parent to challenge the law. In fact, Schempp's parents went along, but he was definitely the instigator. Eventually, the case went to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the Pennsylvania school law mandating Bible reading was declared unconstitutional. I think it's hard not to see the wisdom in that decision, and it's a very good thing that small children from non-standard religions or with no religion don't have to face this coercive pressure. Hinduism and Buddhism are the two fastest growing religions in the U.S., and the Custom Schempp Challenge made a strong statement that children from these religions, as well as Islam, are not fully equal citizens. I've talked about public displays already in analyzing the Pittsburgh case of the nativity scene in the menorah, but let me now mention another one that came up 2 years ago, which of course you all know about since it was right here, part of it. The Ten Commandments seem to many Americans a very important sign of Judeo-Christian traditions that many Americans cherish. Is that? But now you've turned off the mic. Well, I mean, is that all right? No, they can't hear. You see, you have to turn it back on, I think, Rob. You see, now it's completely off. Maybe it will just stop. We'll hope it will. So here we're talking about the commandments. At one extreme, nobody thinks it would be right to require affirmation of the commandments as a condition of public office, as was once done, and not all that long ago in several states. At the other extreme, nobody thinks it objectionable, at least maybe only a few of my legal colleagues who are somewhat extreme, that the building in which the U.S. Supreme Court sits contains a sculpture of Moses holding the Ten Commandments, along with a large number of other sculptural representations of famous lawgivers throughout history. This seems okay to more or less everyone because the connecting theme of all the sculptures is clearly law, or law and its place in history, and no special prominence is given to Moses. No reasonable observer, to use Justice O'Connor's test, would conclude that the sculptures make a statement that non-Judeo-Christians are not fully equal members of the community. And O'Connor mentions in one recent case, you can always find somebody who will object, but she said that's not the point. The reasonable observer standard is not allowing for a heckler, what she calls a heckler's veto. So it's not, so we have to really take reasonable seriously. On those extremes, there's agreement. In the middle, there's a lot of terrain for disagreement. The two cases that came before the court were like this. In McCreary County, Kentucky, displays of the Ten Commandments were required by law in all courthouses and all public schools. The legislature announced that its purpose was to affirm America's Judeo-Christian heritage. When the displays were challenged in the lower courts, they grudgingly added some other parts to the display, setting the Declaration of Independence and other historical documents beside the religious text, saying that their purpose was now to show the formative role played by the Ten Commandments in America's legal history. This is actually a rather strange claim, because the commandments are either so religiously focused that they suggest no direction for law in a pluralistic society, or so general, I mean, thou shalt not kill, and so on, that they suggest no specific or particular direction that a lawgiver could have found useful. We could also add that Jefferson was a very anti-religious man, so far as the Declaration is concerned, it certainly didn't influence him. Meanwhile, my other case, as you well know, the state of Texas has for over 40 years had on the State House grounds a large monument including the whole text of the Ten Commandments, interestingly in a version prepared by an interreligious committee consisting of Protestants, Catholics, and Jews. It was donated by a private organization and it's among many other monuments donated by private organizations that commemorate various things that the various donors want to commemorate, such as the heroes of the Alamo, fallen Confederate soldiers, voluntary firemen, the Texas Rangers, Texas Cowboys, Texas Children, Texas Pioneer Women, Pearl Harbor veterans, the Statue of Liberty, Korean War veterans, World War I veterans, disabled veterans, Texas peace officers, and a few others. In separate cases, both of these displays had been found unconstitutional by lower courts, so the task before the Supreme Court was to resolve the two cases. Inevitably and rightly, the analysis focused on issues of endorsement and equality. The Kentucky display was struck down because it conveyed the message that Judeo-Christian religion is preferred and other sources of value and meaning are dispreferred. And I should add that that was the Protestant version of the Ten Commandments. There was no attempt to be interreligious in the wording, so the message really was that Protestant Christianity is preferred. The Texas display, as you know, was upheld by a very narrow margin, and I think this is very like Allegheny, the Pittsburgh case. That is to say, it's a difficult case because the analysis rightly turns on subtle issues of context and perception. You look in the Supreme Court Reporter, and it's quite a unique case because in the appendices they have little diagrams of the courthouse lawn that show you how far each monument is from the steps and how you have to walk to get in the front door and so on. So there's nothing like this has ever been in the Supreme Court Reporter before. But I guess I think personally that it was rightly decided, but one could certainly argue the other way. What's important is to see how different it is from the Kentucky case. The state is simply allowing different groups to make their own statements, and it's not itself making a statement that endorses Christianity as the state religion. Justice O'Connor's endorsement test, which is the legal version of Madison's much earlier insight, gives good guidance and asks the right questions. Finally, school aid. Tax money may not advance a particular religion over other religions, and it also may not advance religion over non-religion. That's pretty generally agreed. But it's also clear, or I think it should be, that it would be unfair for the state to treat religion with special disfavor. Given that the modern administrative state is so vast, entering into so many aspects of citizens' lives, it's very difficult to withhold all state aid from religion without giving it horrible disadvantages. Suppose that churches didn't have access to the public water supply or the public sewer system. Suppose a burning church would not be aided by the fire department, or on the grounds that the state can't use its money to aid religion. These things look profoundly wrong, and nobody is even suggesting that this is the way things should be. Why? I think it's because we see that equality is once again at issue. If these policies were adopted, then the state would be making a statement that the safety and health of religious people is less important than that of the non-religious. So that's agreement at one end of the spectrum. At the other end, most people seem to agree that it would be terribly wrong if, let's say, the state of Texas declared that it would give tax money only to religious schools. Okay, so once again, there's a lot of terrain in the middle, and it's caused bitter division, particularly about various forms of public aid to sectarian schools. The division is so bitter, I think, in large part because of our tradition of anti-Catholicism. Most of the religious schools in America are Catholic schools, and many Americans have long thought that these schools undermine democracy and breed herd-like obedience to authority. Even those people don't suggest that the parochial schools should not get water or the services of the fire department and the police. But what about a state policy that says, we will pay for the transportation of all children to the schools of their choice on the public buses? That policy existed in New Jersey, and it was challenged in the late 1940s at a time of intense anti-Catholicism. In a famous case that set the parameters for all subsequent cases in this area, the court argued that the transportation policy was not unconstitutional because there was no subsidy for religious instruction or indeed for anything about the religious school itself. The controversy has continued. Can public money be used to pay for special education teachers for children with disabilities, or special remedial needs, teachers who typically travel from school to school, visiting every school in a given area? At one time, the court said this form of aid was unconstitutional. But the court later has reversed itself, and with suitable limits, such a policy would now be okay. Most controversial of all are the various voucher programs, which give parents in a failing public school district, under certain circumstances, some cash they can use to pay their child's tuition at a private or parochial school if they so choose. These policies are problematic because they threaten to undermine the public schools. On the other hand, if they're confined to special cases where the schools have already been declared to be a national disaster area, which was the case in the Cleveland voucher case in 2002, those policies may be, and I think to me they seem to be, acceptable, but only in that limited case. Here as before, though, what's important is to see the equality analysis. We must always ask whether a given form of aid expresses government favor for religion or a particular religion, or whether, by contrast, a given refusal of aid would express actual disfavor for religion. So far in this talk, I have not used the word separation of church and state, which of course are so often used, especially, I think, by the liberals, of whom I'm one in a way. My avoidance of these words is deliberate. This slogan was in fact not part of our original constitutional tradition. It's not to be found in the Constitution or even in the debates leading up to it, and none of the framers used it. They preferred the language of liberty and equality. The slogan arose in the mid-19th century during the panic over Catholic immigration, and it expressed, at first, people's fear that the Catholic Church was going to take over American institutions. To some extent, the words can rise and have risen above that tawdry history, and in the mouths of many thoughtful liberals, they do express admirable values of liberty and equality. But the idea of separation doesn't direct thought well. Total separation of church from state, if we think of it literally, is, as I've suggested, both impossible and undesirable. We don't want to deny the church the fire department and the police. We also don't want to deny priests and ministers the right to run for public office, though at some times in our history people have wanted to do that. How much separation is a good thing and how much is a bad thing? That's the question that we have to ask, and we can answer it well only with recourse to other more fundamental values, in particular those of equal standing in the political community and equal liberty. Once again, I think this area of U.S. legal thought is a valuable one for Europeans to ponder. Many issues that are emerging only now in Europe, such as the crucifix in the Italian public school classrooms, the word Christian in an early draft EU constitution, have been pondered thoroughly in this tradition, and the tradition's analytical framework seems like a good one to bring to the European scene as well, since Europe, too, endorses the basic idea of equal liberty of conscience. The tradition I've praised has many enemies, but we can, in concluding, reduce them all to two, both rather common in decent modern liberal democracies, and so I want to focus the conclusion of this lecture on them. Neither is a double-dyed villain, but both, I think, fail to understand something essential about what equal respect for persons requires. The first opponent I call the establishmentarian. This person thinks that good order and good public culture require a public commitment to a religious orthodoxy, a dominant religious tradition. Life with so many different religions is too chaotic, too fraught, unless we can state quite clearly that this is who we are as a nation. This is our creed, our tradition, these are our religious values, and anyone who wants to live in peace among us has to acknowledge that. Now, of course, the view that I defend requires a nation to take a moral stand, saying this is who we are. Our political principles have a moral content, prominently including the idea of equal respect for citizens. But the establishmentarian says we must go further. We must say this is the primary religion of our community. Establishmentarians are sometimes overtly maligned. Thus, in 17th century Massachusetts, the Puritans imprisoned or expelled people whose beliefs didn't suit the dominant norm. In 19th century America, little Catholic children were penalized if they wouldn't recite the Protestant version of the commandments. Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses were assaulted and killed in substantial numbers. Today, however, the malign sort of establishmentarianism is reasonably unpopular in Europe and North America, and a more cozy, apparently benign form has taken its place. The form that says we need only be clear about who we primarily and centrally are religiously, and then the different can live in peace among us. Now that's really the view I've been targeting all through this talk. It is a view that many Europeans hold, the ones who think it's really important to assert that the EU is fundamentally Christian, the ones who like to retain crucifixes in Italian public school classrooms as a sign of our dominant cultural tradition, and many others. In the US, it's the view of a lot of the religious right. I think it's the view of President Bush. And on the Supreme Court, it's the view of Justices Scalia and Thomas. Justice Scalia said explicitly in his opinion in the Kentucky Ten Commandments case that ours is basically a monotheistic nation, and it's perfectly all right for public monuments and public ceremonies to affirm the truth of monotheism, under which he, interestingly, explicitly included Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, while disfavoring religions such as Hindu polytheism and Buddhist non-theism. And I should say that the local Texas community of Hindus submitted a very well-constructed amicus brief in the Ten Commandments case, trying to show what was so unfair to them about all of this, as well as atheism and agnosticism. The slightly more subtle view of the late Chief Justice Rehnquist was that it was never right to favor a particular religion or religions, but it would be a very good thing, and constitutionally permitted, to favor religion in general over non-religion in general. Now, I think that view is only apparently better because it allows agnostics and atheists to be cast as second-class citizens. What's wrong with this view is that it doesn't treat people as equals. It asks some to subordinate their conscientious commitments to those of others. Even a benign establishmentarianism can actually have quite far-reaching effects, disadvantageous to minorities. It can support policies that use taxpayer money to fund schools only of a particular religious sort, that allow religious tests for public office, and so on. But even when an establishment doesn't do this, and remember the very benign one that Madison was considering in Virginia, which allowed people to opt out of the tax donation to the established church, nonetheless, as Madison said, such a policy, just by announcing a preferred state religion, tells minorities that they do not enter the public square on equal conditions. It asks them to live on terms of second-class citizenship, as public ceremonials announce again and again that the outsiders are not really equal. It's easy to frown on this opponent, at least for American intellectuals for whom these views tend to be associated with the religious right, whom a lot of American intellectuals are accustomed to think of as very different from themselves and not very bright. It's less easy to frown on my second opponent, who's found mostly on the left. This opponent I call the anti-religionist. This position, as you'll see, is kind of the flip side of Rehnquist's. The anti-religionist thinks that all religion should be disfavored in the public square, not for reasons of equality or liberty, but because he or she thinks religion somewhat embarrassing, a relic of a pre-scientific era, and a source of nothing but trouble. And there's recently been a whole spate of books that have this theme, Daniel Dennett, Christopher Hitchens, and Richard Dawkins. So all of this disparagement of religion is now very fashionable once again. So the idea is we can best build lasting democracies if we discourage religion and build on secular scientific rationality. Of course, we should not repress religious people or legally penalize them, but we should certainly discourage them, and there's absolutely no reason to bend over backwards to give religion space to unfold itself. Anti-religionism is official policy in France, though in a form that does not valorize science, as the American forms tend to do. It's the semi-official intellectual creed of post-Nehruvian India, where one will not find many progressive intellectuals, whether Hindu, Muslim, or Christian, who do not speak slightingly about religion in much the way that Jawaharlal Nehru himself did, treating religion as a relic of the past that holds India back from her greatest achievements. It was the view of the great American philosopher and educator John Dewey, whose influence played a key role in the drive to defund religious schools. It's a view that many individual intellectuals express with passion today. What's wrong with anti-religionism as a public doctrine? Well, the first thing that has been wrong with most actual versions of it is that it's likely to be especially harsh toward minority religion. The religion of the majority doesn't look especially religious because it's so much a part of dominant laws and customs that it doesn't stand out. Dewey had few objections to Protestantism because Protestants went to the public schools. After all, why shouldn't they? Everything that went on was Protestant in those schools. Protestants didn't make a fuss about wanting a different version of the Ten Commandments. After all, the one that was ubiquitous was already their version. Protestants didn't ask for special dispensations regarding days of work. After all, they already had Sunday off. So Protestants could be treated as if they were non-religious already. They fit in, and they didn't ask for anything on religious grounds. Anti-Catholics, and here I would include Dewey in this, as you'll see, the role that he played in a minute, like to add that Protestantism shares the anti-religionist's commitment to the autonomy of each person's reason. So even the religious aspect of Protestantism could be seen as a slightly older form of non-religionism. Catholics were another matter. They had their outlandish hierarchies. They had nuns and priests in odd costumes. They had garish ceremonials. And they made a fuss about everything, wanting their own Bible, their own 10 Commandments, and even their own schools. So Dewey and his graduate students, in a less than glorious episode of his career, I think, conducted studies of Catholic communities and wrote, particularly of Catholic communities, Polish immigrants in Philadelphia, that Catholics are not capable of democracy, that they are servile and submissive. It was one of Dewey's graduate students, Paul Blanchard, both Paul Blanchard and Brand Blanchard were graduate students with Dewey. Brand went on to teach philosophy at Yale. Paul Blanchard became the editor of The Nation. Okay, so it was Paul Blanchard who wrote the extremely popular and influential book, American Freedom and Catholic Power, 1949, which told people, and mainly the left, right, because here he is, the editor of The Nation, that the power of the Catholic Church was as great a threat to America as global communism. So the first problem with anti-religionism is that anti-religionists often don't play fair, and anyone who wants to look different gets worse treatment than an equally religious person who looks like the dominant norm, something that has meant that anti-religionism has typically been quite unfair to Jews and Muslims and is so in France today. Jewish yarmulkes and Muslim headscarves are forbidden in French schools, along with large Christian crosses. But it's rarely mentioned that this is an utterly unequal burden, since Jewish men and Muslim women regard the forbidden articles of dress as religiously required, while Christianity does not oblige Christians to wear large crosses, or indeed not any cross. The second problem with anti-religionism is that it's likely to be stingy with accommodations. Because it thinks that religion is fundamentally not very important, it's not likely to go out of its way to give people special dispensations from laws of general applicability on grounds of conscience. Drug laws, laws about work days, military laws, all of these will be arranged to suit the convenience of the modern state. If the anti-religionist thinks a particular war wrong, then he or she may uphold a limited right to conscientious objection in that case, but not on grounds of conscience in the traditional sense. Anti-religionists simply don't have very much respect for conscience insofar as it exercises itself in a religious way. Third and most basic, even a fair anti-religionism is not compatible with a thoroughgoing commitment to equal respect. Anti-religionism says, here we are, the enlightened ones, and Dan Dennett, the philosopher, calls himself and his fellow anti-religionists the brights. This was in an op-ed piece in the New York Times called The Bright Stuff. We brights see more clearly than you dummies over there. I think this is not a very good stance to take toward one's fellow citizens in a world full of mystery and complexity, where it's a very good bet that nobody, not the anti-religionist either, has the ultimate solution to questions about the meaning of life and death that have plagued humanity ever since humanity began to exist. If scientific anti-religionists think they do have that answer in the form, for example, of a reductive physiological account of the life and death of organisms, we should protest that this is an answer so drained of mystery and genuine curiosity that it's this answer, not the traditions of the religions, that demeans humanity and compromises the project of building a rich, multifaceted state based on respect for humanity. The framers of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 agreed not to base the Declaration on any specific religious or ethical teaching, but they did need to agree, they thought, on a moral view of human dignity that made human beings not mere bundles of matter, not mere objects to be used for the ends of efficiency. Nehru and John Dewey, of course, were not the scoffing sort of anti-religionist, and it insults them even to mention them together with Dennett. But then they should have understood, as Dennett probably wouldn't, that the complex mysteries of human life call forth many different types of committed searching from conscience in human beings, some forms being religious and some forms non-religious, and that the capacity with which people conduct this search is worthy of the greatest respect and of fully equal respect, whether the form the search takes is religious or non-religious. On his night table on the day of his death, Nehru had copied out in his own hand these lines from Robert Frost. "The woods are lovely, dark, and deep, but I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep." That a man with such a profound sensitivity to the depths of human striving should so often have denigrated the religious form this striving took in the vast majority of his countrymen is a sad fact, one to be explained perhaps by the strange confluence of Marxism and elitism in his education. In any case, we should follow Nehru's poetic soul and not his cramped vision of his fellow citizens as we try to cultivate the humanity in each of us that will sustain our own developing commitment to democracy. The human capacity of conscience is a delicate and vulnerable thing, as Roger Williams said. It needs support from laws and institutions. Because it's worthy of respect, it's also worthy of fully equal support. An approach to political principles based on the idea of respect for persons should learn from the tradition I've described and reject both establishmentarianism and anti-religionism in order to be fully fair to all human beings.
Wonderful.
We have two mics set up for the question period. The reason we like to use this is we are immortalizing this through the resources of the web. So if you go to the mic, you'll be able to hear your question.
Okay, great.
Let me make sure that the mic's on.
Yeah, you often have to turn a switch, so you might just breathe into it and see if it's on all right now. I'll check the other one.
Yeah, that's it.
Oh, good. Somebody can do the same thing with the other one. Sure, absolutely. Why don't you just sit down? Okay.
You mentioned that we shouldn't deny churches the services of police and fire, which I've never heard before. You don't address the question which has been seriously discussed about the nature and extent of tax exemption for churches. Would you comment on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, actually, the police and fire, although I don't know anyone who seriously proposed it as a political idea, but it is actually treated at some length in Everson versus Board of Education, that 1947 case about the transportation, because what they're trying to ask is transporting all the children on the public buses more like just giving the services of the police and the fire department to the church, which would be okay, or is it more like some kind of direct subsidy to religion, which would not be okay? So it's not made up by me. I mean, I think that the charitable exemption, the traditional view is that you can do it if you have a broad program which doesn't single out the religious element of it. So, for example, there was a case, Waltz versus Tax Commission, where there was a tax subsidy for charitable institutions or nonprofit charitable institutions, and they upheld that on the grounds that religious institutions were certainly a large proportion of them, but it included others as well. Then, another Texas case, there's Texas Monthly, a famous case, where there was a periodical called Wide Awake that was published, and I can't remember where it was, but anyway, in some place in Texas, there was a law passed that exempted periodicals with a religious nature from certain forms of taxation. Now, in that case, the Supreme Court said, no. I mean, that's a direct subsidy to religion. If you go back and rethink it and you have a principle that says all periodicals dealing with the meaning of life and death or something, then that would be okay. And I think that's basically the right thing. Yeah, I mean, obviously, you can always play games with that and try to fudge it, but I think you know, in that case, it would be fine for the, if there really was a broad-based program so that non-religious and religious periodicals with a certain kind of subject matter could all be exempted. Another related thing is in the University of Virginia, they had student fees which went to support all the student groups, the student activities, and the only one that they said you couldn't channel any part of that to the religious organization. And so that was really an interesting case that went on the other side, because the Supreme Court ultimately held that that was unconstitutional too. You just can't single out the religious club and say because they're talking about God, they can't get any student fees, but the ones who talk about politics and the ones who talk about gardening and all the others can get the student fees. So that's the other side of that. And I also think that case was rightly decided, although it was a very, very controversial case at the time. Yeah, come to the mic.
Hey, Martha, thanks for that. Just a quick question about whether there might not be an interesting presupposition in some of what you were saying about religion being distinctively expressive of conscience, and whether that idea, and distinguishing it, say, from other moral, I think explicitly toward the end, and even political views, and the prospect of those being distinctively expressive of conscience. Just a quick thought is, and sometimes I do think that calling atheism by a name that ends in ISM encourages a possible misperception on in this area. But in any case, whether that idea, the idea that religious is distinctively expressive of conscience, is itself a majoritarian, but nevertheless optional view that could be seen as problematic from
Oh yeah, no, I mean you've got right to the heart of actually the deepest problem in this tradition, which I, because it's so complicated, I couldn't do it in this lecture, but let me say something about it. Yeah, you could see that when I talked about establishment, I was very careful to say that I think it's right that we don't favor religion, even religion in general, over non-religion. And I think that's the right way to understand the tradition behind the Establishment Clause. It's clearly the view that Roger Williams held. It's the view that Madison held, I believe. I mean, actually, at the time of Madison's memorial and remonstrance, fewer than 20% of Americans belonged to any recognized church. Now, no doubt many of them were very religious, but they were kind of weird, solitary seekers like Roger Williams himself, who never found a church that suited him. But some of them, certainly were agnostics or deists or someplace on that spectrum. And I do think that Madison already meant to say that they should enter the polity on equal conditions. But on the Free Exercise Clause, we have this issue about accommodation. On what grounds do you get accommodation? You get accommodation on grounds of conscience in a more narrowly religious sense. Well, what can we say about that? Now, lawyers, my law colleagues say, well, the word religion is there, whatever reason there is behind that, so that's what we have to work with. Now, if you look at the early drafts, you find that they toyed with many things, and they did actually use the word conscience in quite a lot of the early drafts of the Free Exercise Clause. They said equal liberties of conscience and so on. But somehow, I think what happened was that they decided they needed to use the word exercise in order to make it clear that it protected practices, not just belief. But then the phrase free exercise of conscience seemed a little strange because conscience was connected more with belief. So they put in free exercise of religion as a word that was more linked to practice. At least that's how I think that unfolded. It's very hard to tell. But in any case, the problem always has been what about people who have other grounds for wanting dispensations from laws of general applicability? Is this tradition that gives special dispensations from these general laws fair to those people? Well, people who worry a lot about this tend to come back to the Lockean position for a different reason. I mean, not for Locke's initial reason that there's too much chaos or anarchy, not for Scalia's reason, which is also a worry about public order, but for the reason of fairness itself. That is, I mean, how can it be fair to give accommodations only on grounds of religion, but if we give accommodations to everyone who comes along and says, I have a view of life and its meaning, then that's unadministrable, so the only conclusion is no accommodations. Now, see, I start from the other end, in a way, saying that I think we can see from history that accommodations are essential to avoid very deep and profound forms of unfairness, and that this unfairness is very, very often linked to membership in minority or unpopular religion, partly because it's a religious body that's likely to have rules about what day you get together. And if you're a loner, you're not so likely to feel that you must go on a particular day. But of course, there are people who are not who do feel compelled by their conscience to do something. But my thought is, historically, the largest group of people who would suffer serious wrongs if there were no accommodations are members of minority religions. So if we end that practice, those people will be in a very perilous position. So what could we do to mitigate the unfairness to the ones who have reasons of conscience that are not religious? And what I argue in the book is that we should do what the court did do in the Vietnam era, which is to adopt a broader, more expansive notion of conscience, which includes, now the two plaintiffs who won in the Vietnam era, one was named Seeger, and Seeger said that he had a religion, but it turned out he didn't believe in God, and that was what was contested, because the Selective Services law said belief in a relation to a supreme being. And the court said, well, that doesn't mean that you really have to believe in God. What you have to do is to have a belief that occupies a position in your life analogous to the position that the belief in God occupies in the life of the believer. And Seeger had quite a lot to say about his metaphysics, that he was some mixture of Buddhism and ethical thought and so on. So clearly he did have that. Now then the second guy who came along, Welsh, was even more difficult because he crossed out the word religion on his CO form. And he said, I have an ethical creed that says that killing is always wrong. I mean, so they never get into the question if you believe a particular war is wrong. But Welsh was an ethical pacifist. So there they extended it a little bit further, but they did it, I think, in an unfortunate way, because they said, well, now what's at issue is the subjective intensity of his belief. And anyone who has a belief that's so intense, that can count as religious. I think that was a very stupid way to go, because if you think about it, most sports fans have very intense attachments to their teams. And if I say, as a big White Sox fan that I am, well, I don't want to come to work now because there's this playoff game that I got to see. Much though I love them, I don't really think I should get that exemption. And I think if I was fired for not coming to work because of baseball attendance, I shouldn't get unemployment compensation. So one has to draw the lines in some reasonable way, and you can't do it by subjective intensity, is what I think. I think the Seeger way was much better. That is something like, this is a set of beliefs that organizes your life. And then there's another lower court case called Malnak versus Yogi, where they were talking about transcendental meditation, where they also say, well, there are a number of indicia of religion-likeness. One of them is content. It concerns ultimate matters. Another one is, one thing that you often have, but don't always have to have, is organized group. And so they have 3 or 4 different criteria, which are not necessary and sufficient conditions, but they're just things you would look for in determining whether it could be extended to that case. And I think that's the right way to go. We want to have as comprehensive a policy on that as we can. And let's hope we can do it fairly and in a principled way. Kent Greenewalt, in his great book about the Free Exercise Clause, which came out last year, He says he thinks we even need to have different criteria for different areas of the law, that where it's the draft, when what you would be doing if you were conscripted against your will would be killing. That's a very deep matter. Well, there we should be as generous as possible with our accommodations, whereas with the drug laws, he thinks, well, you're foregoing something, but it may not be as essential to life and death and so on. So he suggests having tougher policies with the drug, because you can easily see why, right? Because there are any number of bogus claimants in the drug areas. I mean, I could name them. In fact, one reason that Oregon had this rather stiff drug law was that there was a marijuana-growing quasi-religion called the something Church of the Great Boo-Hoo, which said that they believed they had been commanded by God to grow the herbs of the field, and so on. And the herbs of the field, guess what that turned out to be? And so you always have these bogus claimants in the area of drugs. So you have to have a slightly less sympathetic policy. I think that's probably basically reasonable, but what we do have to be aware of is that we're not very good at thinking about the religion nature of unfamiliar religion. The way that people have dealt with Native American religion over the years has been shameful, and they've been religious character because it was not Protestantism. So I would rather have something like the Seeger principle across the board, and then we have to give the would-be drug users particularly tough scrutiny and administer it a little more harshly, but have the same principle for all. But you see, then what happens is that the Establishment Clause does have a slightly, it looks at things in a slightly different way from the free exercise side. You may be giving, in the end, religious right that the non-religious have at least a harder time getting. And then, as I say, if that's justified at all, it's justified on grounds of the harms historically that would be done in the other way. And on the Establishment Clause side, though, you really do treat them all on a par, and you really say, we're not going to give general favor to religion or to non-religion. However, of course, there's another thing. That is, the non-religious get something of a break on the Establishment Clause side, because if I want to put up a public library display honoring the birthday of Immanuel Kant, I have no constitutional problem doing that. And if I want to put up a public library display honoring the birthday of Jesus Christ, I do have a constitutional problem. So that in that way, we might think things balance out in the long run. The non-religious get certain areas of discretion under the Establishment Clause, and the religious get certain areas of accommodation under the free exercise.
I think we're going to have to call. Are you been waiting for a question? All right, go ahead. Yes.
Sorry, I answered that at so little length, but it's such a great question. So
yeah.
This is a little bit related to that. You bring up issues of things that don't compromise health and safety, such as the peyote case or the days of the work week. What about sort of hot button issues that are current now of like clitorectomies or other discrimination against women, or you could imagine something like assisted suicide, these kinds of things that may compromise health and safety, as some majority might call it, but others could say it's their liberty of conscience.
Yeah, that's another great question. In my book, Women and Human Development, I have a whole chapter basically on that. Now, I think we have to here separate two things. One question being what would the ideal constitutional order be like, and the other being what would actually happen under the U.S. Constitution as I've described it. The ideal thing that I suggest is that we have the following situation, that we do have the generous understanding that we may not apply a substantial burden to a person's religion without a compelling state interest, but that compelling state interest, which is a notion that's never been sufficiently theorized or articulated, should be understood to include protection of all what I call the central human capabilities up to a reasonable threshold level, which then would certainly rule out unwilling genital mutilation or any kind of undermining of health. I mean, now when a person of mature age chooses to have plastic surgery and risk her health in a liposuction procedure or something, I don't feel we should rule that out. So I think age and autonomy are crucial here, but certainly there are lots and lots of procedures that are performed on very young girls without their consent, and those would be treated as absolutely off limits. Glad to see in the New York Times this morning a story on the increasing resistance to female genital mutilation in Egypt, where sub-Saharan Africa, there's very organized feminist resistance that's been going on for a long time. And in Egypt, there's been official resistance, but not much organized grassroots resistance. So now that's growing. And yeah, so there are all kinds of things that would come up under that. So the notion of compelling state interest, back to the US tradition, the compelling state interest has never been adequately theorized. And so when we think about health, I think people are pretty quick to come to something like the conclusion that I would like anyway. So Jehovah's Witnesses can't refuse blood transfusions on behalf of their children or something like that. And any real, that is non-symbolic form of female genital cutting would certainly be something that one could deny despite the religious claim, which, of course, there is no genuine religious claim in that case anyway, by the way, because Islam has always opposed that practice from the from the Quran straight on, and Islamic leaders in every country have said it's not only not required by Islam, but it's actually against the spirit of Islam. So it's tradition, it's not religion. But anyway, there are other things that are less clear in America. I mean, what about the Amish who wanted to stop their children from going to school at age 14 and have them come home and work on the farm on the grounds that that form of education was essential to the continuity of their whole community? Now, that case had a sex equality aspect, which was never brought out very much because the boys were learning carpentry and farming, which are things that were easily exportable. If they wanted to leave the community, they had a way of earning an income. The young girls were learning domestic skills, things that would not be marketable. And so there was a way in which they were being prevented from choosing other ways of life. I think that case is a very tough case, and I do talk about it. I think, what probably we have to ask is what happens between 14 and 16? Is that the time when people learn essential skills of autonomy, or is really that more of a time for dating and peer pressure? And, I guess I think as a parent that maybe if you haven't learned critical thinking and autonomy before you're 14, the years between 14 and 16 might not be the time that would be most propitious to that. But anyway, I think it's a very, very tough case, and I think particularly tough because of the sex equality aspect, because are we really cutting off girls from a meaningful life choices? But so anyway, I think the notion of compelling state interest has a lot more work to do. Here's just one more, since I know time is getting short. One of the cases that did hold that there was, on the one hand, a substantial burden, but on the other hand, a compelling state interest, so the practice had to stop, we'll see what it is. It was Bob Jones University. Bob Jones University forbade interracial dating, and they wanted to keep their charitable tax exemption. Well, the Supreme Court held that to deprive them of the charitable tax exemption was indeed a substantial burden to their religion, but that there was a compelling state interest in eradicating racism. Now, think about Notre Dame University, Boston University, all the Catholic universities virtually, except for Georgetown, which now has a lay president and a lay board, they all have to have priests as their presidents, usually from a particular order of priests, therefore males. And so one could easily envisage a parallel to Bob Jones saying, well, substantial burden, we're going to deprive you, Notre Dame, of your tax exemption, but there's a compelling state interest in eradicating sexism. It should happen. It never will happen. And, simply because of political factors, it would just be politically unimaginable. And, one hesitates to say that with a Catholic majority on the Supreme Court, but, I think it's less likely to happen than it happened before. But it is a similar case. And, what's frustrating is that sex equality is never taken to be an interest of the same strength as racial equality. But, of course, it should be.
Great. Thank you. Thanks so much. That was wonderful. Really enjoyed it. Good. Okay, thank you all for coming. Appreciate it. And remember, 3 weeks from today, Michael Berube, same place, same time. Please come.
That's great that you're having all my friends.
Yeah.
Michael, I haven't seen for